Okay, hi everybody. We're continuing on the Kuzari. In our discussion of language. And we're on page 238, where Rabbi Yehuda Halevi has just finished arguing that the Hebrew language is a special language. It's the language which God used to create the Torah, and it has a very rich vocabulary, so rich that it can be used by the prophets to describe all aspects of the human condition. That's really what he was trying to communicate. And of course, as we know, this is not an argument that is made in a vacuum. It is an argument that is made as a polemic against the attack that Judaism was under, that Judaism and all things Jewish are inherently inferior to the parent culture. Parent culture in Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's time is the Andalusian, Arabic, Islamic culture that is rich with philosophy and with architecture and with art, with music and poetry. And Judaism lacks all of that, it seems. And of course, one of the defenses that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi offers is that as a people that have gone into exile, we've lost a tremendous amount of the richness of our heritage and our culture, and especially when it comes to the more esoteric aspects of a people's culture, which are its art, its music, its poetry, etc. And included in that is its language. But at the same time, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi wants to express pride in the parts of Judaism that still exist as far as language are concerned. Our language is quite rich. Our language contains so much that it is even a greater, a superior language to all other languages that are currently out there. So comes along the Kuzari in paragraph number 69. You know, up until now, we've been discussing some halachic issues having to do with prayer and having to do with the intrinsic quality of the Hebrew language. There was just one last thing I wanted to mention. The halachic authorities discuss, because we know that according to the Ramban and Rabbi Yehuda Halevi that we've discussed over the last few weeks, Hebrew has an inherent holiness to it. Do you have to treat conversational Hebrew and give it elevated status? Meaning that there was a question that was presented to a number of poskim in Israel. Are you allowed to speak Hebrew in the bathroom? Right? Can you sing O Solomio in Hebrew when you're taking a shower? Right? In other words, if Hebrew has an inherent holiness to it, perhaps just like you can't study Torah in the bathroom, you can't speak Hebrew. And of course, that would be disastrous for Israeli society, because if I'm brushing my teeth in the bathroom at the same time with my wife, I can't say pass the toothpaste, honey, in Hebrew. Tanili forget how do you say toothpaste? What is it called? Mivrashet shinayim. Mishchat shinayim, right. You know, I wouldn't be allowed to say that in Hebrew because I'm using a language which is inherently holy and we're inside the washroom. So this was a question that has been raised to a number of poskim. There are poskim who actually are machmir on this issue, and they say that a person should avoid speaking or singing in Hebrew when he's taking a shower or in the washroom. But that's a minority opinion. The majority opinion is that when Hebrew is used for divrei chulin, for non-holy purposes, it does not have enough of that inherent kedusha that would preclude you from using it in the washroom. Yes?
There's a lot of jewelry that women wear with Hebrew writing on it, and invariably you have to go to the washroom, so...
That's a very good question. You know, if the jewelry has a pasuk on it, has a verse from Tanakh, that has an intrinsic holiness, and it would have to be covered up when you go to the washroom. If it just has your Hebrew name, like Yocheved or Sarah or whatever it is, so then you wouldn't have to cover it up. Okay? Issues come up if you're wearing a mezuzah. So people wear a mezuzah as a whatever it's called, a pendant. Yeah. So then that's a problem. You'd have to cover that up before you go to the washroom. But, you know, there is a Hasidic tradition that you do not use, in Eretz Yisrael, you do not use Hebrew as your conversational speech. That's why they dafka speak Yiddish in Eretz Yisrael, certain Hasidic communities, because they feel that it's a profanation almost of the holy tongue to use it as the spoken conversational word, you know, for saying pass the toothpaste. But again, this is all having to do with different degrees of emphasis on the intrinsic holiness of the Hebrew language. But now let's get back to the aesthetics for a moment, because this is where Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is leading us in paragraph 69 on page 238. So the Kuzari said, the benefit of all these citations and others like them has been merely to prove that Hebrew is as rich as other languages. All you've succeeded in showing me that when you say that there's a lot of rich words, there's a rich vocabulary in the Hebrew language from the words of Tanakh, fine, I understand that. But what advantage does it have? On the contrary, other languages are superior in their suitability for poems in lyrics composed for singing. Now, what he's getting at over here is something that is not readily accessible to you and me, because we are not fluent in Arabic. However, the Arabic language, which is really what he's referring to, has a certain symmetry to it, has a certain, almost like a musical cadence to it, in that the words are, the way that they flow has a certain kind of ebb and flow that lends itself more readily to poetry and to music. And the Hebrew language has starts and stops, at least the way Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is describing it, which does not lend itself so well to the recital of public poetry. And therefore, from an aesthetic standpoint, the argument is that Arabic should be considered a superior language and not Hebrew. So he's putting aside the historical issue of God creating the world with the Hebrew language, and he says, to that argument that you're saying that from an aesthetics point of view, Hebrew is superior. That's not true. I can understand that Hebrew has a richness to it just as much as other languages, but Arabic seems to have this aesthetic superiority that Hebrew does not possess. So in paragraph 70, the rabbi says, it is clear to me that lyrics do not need to be balanced if they are going to be spoken. For example, even though the lines in the psalm do not have the same number of syllables, one can nevertheless sing Hodu Lashem Kitov with the same meter as La'osei Niflaot Gidolot. Now what he's driving at is that in Arabic, the poets had a very carefully measured way of making sure that you had exactly the same number of syllables on every line. But when you go through the Tehillim and you see David HaMelech's poetic compositions, especially what we call the Halel HaGadol, which is that 26-line psalm from chapter 136, contains, you know, at every end of the sentence, the refrain is Ki le'olam chazdo, Hodu Lashem ki tov, Ki le'olam chazdo, Hodu le'elokei ha'elokim, Ki le'olam chazdo, Hodu la'adonei ha'adonim, Ki le'olam chazdo, Losini la'ot g'dolot levado, Ki le'olam chazdo. There is not always the same, it's not metered properly. In other words, if we were all, and I'm not, if we were all poetry experts, we would say, well, this isn't even. It's not an even meter. Like you look at Shakespeare, iambic pentameter. Remember that from grade school. There was a certain kind of ebb and flow in the language. Everything was metered properly, balanced properly. And you don't have that in the Tehillim. So he says, but Rabbi Yehuda Halevi says, that's only a problem if you're preparing poetry which is supposed to be recited not as a spoken conversational language, but rather as a performance language. A performance language has to be metered properly because people are trying to pick up the aesthetics of the performance. But Hebrew is meant to be a spoken conversational language, not a performance language. And he says this is true, however, only with songs that are controlled by their speaker who can pause and join words at appropriate places. But regarding those poems that you mentioned above, which were composed for public recital, in which have symmetrical qualities, the Jews were not interested in them because they were concerned with something which was of even greater benefit and more exalted. What's more important than the aesthetics of public poetry, of performance poetry? The Kuzari said, and what is that? The rabbi said, the purpose of language is to allow that which is within the soul of the speaker to enter into the soul of the listener. Communication is what he's talking about. This purpose cannot be accomplished properly unless the two are face to face. This is the advantage that the spoken word has over the written word, as the saying goes, from the mouths of the scribes and not from the mouths of the books. When you want to communicate something, reading it sometimes from the printed page, you lose something in the translation from the printed page because you're not listening to the inflection, the gestures, the pauses, the rise and fall in the voice that is represented by the spoken word. One can better understand oral communication because the speaker pauses at the conventional stops, speaks continuously when the sentences should be connected, and uses harsh or soft intonation. The speaker can also use body language, eye movement, expressions of the mouth, and so on, to indicate when he is amazed, inquisitive, engaged in providing ordinary information, hopeful, fearful, or submissive. These body signals convey the message much more efficiently than a message that lacks them. The speaker can be aided by the movements of his eyes and his eyebrows, his head and his hands in communicating anger, desire, submissiveness, or arrogance to the desired degree.
That's the problem with email.
Yes,
That is, oh, very good. That's exactly the problem with email. Every email sounds like you're angry. Even there's something, I forget what it's not Murphy's Law, but it's another law like Murphy's Law. Basically what it says, it's having to do with text messages and emails. That sarcasm never works, because anything that you say is taken absolutely literally and seriously, because no one can tell the inflection of your voice when you're communicating by email. And so unless you explain, like you could say, I just ate my cat, right? And so if you don't say ha ha at the end of the text message, or happy face or something like that, people will take you seriously, right? So that's the problem with written communication, precisely. So this remnant that we possess of our language, listen to what he says now, which was created by God, unlike other languages, contains certain acute and penetrating features which were embedded within it to explain content and to take the place of those gestures which are communicated in face-to-face contact. These features are the cantillation signs, the ta'amim. And he says that's what we call the trup. You know, those cantillation marks. Ezra went ahead and reinstituted the cantillation marks according to the Gemara, but according to tradition, they were passed down to us together with the Torah, which we use to read our holy texts. They indicate where to pause and where to continue reading. They differentiate the question from the answer, the subject from the predicate, that which is said hastily from that which is said slowly, that which is commanded from that which is requested, and whole books can be written on this subject of cantillation. And in my footnote, I tell you, there are whole books written on the subject. In Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's time, perhaps they didn't have whole books written on the subject because he was very, very early on in the process. But there have been dozens and dozens of books written since Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's time on the cantillation marks and how to explain them and how to interpret them. We don't know whether the way that we sing trup today is exactly correct. Sephardim have the same cantillation marks, but they sing the cantillation marks differently. But the purpose of the cantillation marks is universal. It is to try and recreate human inflection and gestures when the written word is being recited publicly. It is therefore, for example, you have the et nachta. Have you ever heard of the et nachta? It is the major pause in the middle of the sentence. That's because if you don't pause, you can change the entire meaning of the word. You know, just as an example, a panda eats, shoots, and leaves. But a guy who walks into a bar, eats, shoots, and leaves is doing something totally different. When you say, let's have grandma for lunch, right? That can mean two different things, depending upon the inflection, depending upon the pauses and how you say that sentence. Let's have grandma for lunch, or let's have grandma for lunch, you know. But so anyway, that's the point, is that there are places where you're supposed to pause, places where you're not supposed to pause, and it's really a whole science, and that's what the trup, that's what the Neginat Hatam, the Te'amim, is supposed to try and substitute. The rabbis, in their great wisdom, understanding that public recital of Torah reading can only be meaningful if it's recited with proper pauses and dramatic rises and falls, told us that we have to read the Torah with the Ta'amim. Now, the truth of the matter is that if we don't recreate the conveyance of the sentence when we recite the trup, it's because we don't really understand the trup properly. I want to make sure that I'm saying that correctly. When we listen to a bar mitzvah boy lane, right? So his laning does not automatically, you know, the meaning of the words don't automatically jump out at us because of the way that he's laning. But that's because he wasn't trained to understand that the purpose of the trup is to recreate the meaning of the sentence. He was just taught that mapach, pashta, zokeh, katon, right? That's all he was taught. He doesn't know any different. So he wasn't taught that this is supposed to be a method, a form of communication. You know, I was thinking, let me just finish this and then I'll just go to one more point. So he says, one who wishes, we're top of page 241, one who wishes to accomplish all this will certainly forego measured poetry. One who recites in meter will end up proceeding where there should be a pause and pausing where there should be a procession. He will be able to remedy this only with great difficulty. And so therefore, yes, there are certain rules of metered poetry. Remember, we learned several weeks ago that in the 10th century in Spain, there was this tremendous debate between Menachem ibn Suruk and Dunash ibn Labrat as to whether Hebrew poetry should imitate Arabic poetry or not. And eventually one side won that, you know, Arabic poetry is the standard, so we have to imitate it. And of course, the Arabic style of poetry demanded very fixed meters because of the aesthetics of the sound. But the problem is that you lose something. You lose the communication of the words for the sake of the meter. And so you'll end up pausing at the wrong place and so forth. But Hebrew was never interested in the aesthetics of the meter. It was interested more in the communication. There's something now that's in part of our pop culture called poetry slam. Has anyone ever heard of poetry slam? Today they use the same, you're familiar with that? They use the same kind of idea where many of the sentences are not metered properly, but when you use the proper inflection, and it's very inflection-based, poetry slam. It's almost like a hip-hop way of speaking to be able to speak poetically. And when I listen to that, it almost sounds to me like that's what the trup was trying to accomplish. Here's a guy who won a contest. I'll play you just a little bit of this poetry slam. You get the idea of how he's pausing and commencing with the rising and falling of his voice, and it creates that dramatic effect. You know, I'll give that, listen to this. This is called Gravity.
Isaac Newton invented gravity, everyone knows that. He sat alongside the highest branch of a tree, cross-legged, childlike, musing on how weird it all was. While reaching down to pick a fruit already yearning upwards, he realized what was missing. He tossed the apple high above him, resigned to watching it float tortuously away like most of his good ideas in those days, juggling with scarcely fathomable formulae. Then, precisely at the moment of conception, he plopped to the ground with the graceless ceremony of a nickel in a slot machine. Adam ate it, it smacked our Isaac on the crown, and Steve Jobs sold it to you. Gravity, man's first disobedience. Things went well for a while. Getting around was a lot easier, and Isaac and his friends bought each other shoes to celebrate. Buildings went up and stayed down now. Trampoline sales increased exponentially, and the sea found its place. No longer just a huge, inconvenient raindrop. But like any stroke of genius, things got out of hand. People grappled with designs that Isaac hadn't planned. He knew he'd born a fickle monster that they couldn't understand. Delusional in their conviction that things always land feet first, butter side up. They were sprinting before they could even crawl. He tried to stall what he foresaw, tried to recall a product flawed for its complete monopoly, but there was no clause for opting out, which they seemed to have forgotten. He regretted his invention lacked an on-off switch or safety catch. He snatched a breath as his new history folded like dominoes before him. Dominoes that never fell but only flipped before him. He saw pennies drop, bodies thick with knowledge plummet lone from library windows, planes crash and towers crumble, lands slide and swallow people, bombs sail and harbour evil. He was a terrorist. He knew the original disaster from which all other disasters grew. He wanted to undo it. He knelt and hammered Control Z with his fists into the earth, choked by a curse. They'd never learn, he said. A prototypal Spider-Man, power and responsibility colliding in his mind like two slabs of enriched uranium. He couldn't see then, though. By calculating his descent, he'd assured his elevation, like a propane flame through the halls of fame of science's greatest accidental inventions, because for everyone that falls, there are 1,000 books in 100 arms climbing the library stairs on his behalf. For everything that crumbles, there are monuments erected in defiant celebration. For every slip and broken bone follows 80 epic baseball catches. It made the sky a place to aim for. Made Buzz Aldrin and Felix Baumgartner not just normal blokes. It made 1 million kids look at the moon wanting nothing but to try it. We need the speed of our flying dreams. We need gravity to defy it. Thanks very much.
That's very good.
I don't know if I understood all of it, but the point is that when you listen to this kind of poetry slam, you can see that he's controlling the meter, not based on the words themselves, but based on the ebb and flow of he controls the movement of the sentence. The purpose of the trup was to control the movement of the sentence and not let the structure of the words control the movement of the sentence in the communication. So anyway, so that's what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi wants to communicate. You may think that Arabic has an inherent superiority because of the way that it sounds, but in reality, Hebrew was never interested in the way that it meters out in a line of poetry, but rather was more interested in the way that we communicate with each other. Okay. So the Kuzari replies, he says, you're right. The benefit of acoustics should be sacrificed for the benefit of understanding. Metered poetry provides pleasant sound, but this tradition of the cantillations explains the content. Yet I see your Jewish community toiling to compose metered poetry in imitation of other nations. You are using Hebrew according to their standards. And this, once again, is the voice of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi embedded within the Khazar king, criticizing Jewish cultural practices of his time, which is, why are you being copycats? What is it about the insecurity of the Jew that compels him to emulate the cultural standards of the world around him? Why don't you utilize Hebrew in the way that it was meant to be used, which is to communicate and not to compose very highly stylized metered poetry? And the response that the rabbi has is, this is because we have strayed and rebelled. That's the only way to say it. Not only have we forsaken this advantage, we are corrupting the very essence of our language. It was designed to unify by having one universal reading of its texts via the cantillation signs and inflections, but instead we have made it a source of disunity. And we'll continue this discussion about how we've corrupted the Hebrew language. We'll talk in Mirz Hashem. We'll continue this discussion later on. Now we're going to be entering into a realm as we get further and further on. Maybe we'll just go a few more lines before we close the book. We're going to get into some dikduk, and we're going to probably have to skip that section, just because when I was 17, I was very excited about dikduk. But I found that no one else that I knew was interested. It was, it's a nerdy thing to be interested in, I guess. But it's not, it doesn't make for a very exciting class. Usually when I talk about dikduk, I get the glazed over look from about 80 or 90% or 99% of the audience. So the point that he wants to say, so if you look in paragraph 75, the Kuzari says, in what way have you corrupted and made the Hebrew the source of disunity? The rabbi said, have you ever seen 100 people reading the same text as if they were one person, pausing at the same time and commencing at the same time? The Kuzari said, I have already considered this, and indeed I have never seen anything like this, neither in the Roman nor the Arabic lands. This could not occur with the recitation of poetry. Tell me how Hebrew acquired this advantage and how metered poetry undermines it. And what he's going to do is he's going to demonstrate that there's a certain melodiousness to the Hebrew language which obligates us, when we abide by the rules of the ta'amim and the rules of dikduk, that even if 100 people were to read the language in unison, as long as we all know the rules of the language and the rules of the trup, we would all end up reciting the Hebrew exactly the same in unison together. Now, again, like I say, for us, it's very difficult because we were not trained that way. I find it highly lamentable that our children are not properly taught dikduk in most of the Jewish day schools in this town. Not only in this town, but in most towns throughout the Jewish world. Our children are not taught what trup is. Our children are not taught what dikduk is properly. It affects the way they daven, and it affects the way they learn Torah, and it affects their ability to truly understand the richness of the Hebrew language, which results in a very much watered down ability for them to appreciate the beauty of the texts that we have in Hebrew. And so it's a problem. The problem is that none of our teachers know how to teach it, and therefore none of our kids know how to learn it, because the teachers don't know it, so how do we expect the kids to know it? And so it's a never-ending cycle. It's one of those areas of Jewish education which was sort of largely ignored. By the way, we talked a little bit about last week the influence of the Reformation on certain halachic principles of language. If you remember that discussion we had last week, the Reformation in the 19th century also had adverse effects in other ways as well. One of the adverse effects that the Reformation had on Jewish scholasticism is that it took away the importance of learning dikduk from the Orthodox world, because people that were the maskilim, the members of the Haskalah, the enlightened Jewish world that is synonymous with the Reformation, these people emphasized the importance of the Hebrew language, and they emphasized the importance of dikduk and a careful study of Hebrew. And that meant that was one of the battlegrounds, that was one of the lines of demarcation, whether you were a maskil or whether you were a traditional Jew, is whether you emphasized Hebrew language in your curriculum, in your yeshiva or not. And so as a result, and we're suffering to it even into the 21st century, there's an aversion in the more religious schools to teach issues of language and dikduk, because that's a maskil dika thing to do, when that's ridiculous. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was not a maskil. He wasn't fighting the Haskalah. We're not fighting the Haskalah either today in the year 2017. But this is a remnant, an unfortunate remnant, and there's an aversion to doing anything that breaks from tradition in many circles, and that's the reason why it's not taught more properly. Yes?
I'm just thinking that there are schools that teach in Yiddish, and how do they manage to learn the depth of Torah if they're not learning Hebrew, they're learning Yiddish?
Well, the Yiddish is their spoken language.
Yeah.
So,
but to learn Torah, you have to understand Hebrew.
Well, true. I'm saying, but our children, it's not an issue of what their spoken language is. Our children speak in English.
Yeah.
So they translate every pasuk into English. So they translate every pasuk into Yiddish.
You have to understand how Hebrew works to really understand the depth of the passage.
I agree. But that's the problem if you're an English-speaking day school as much as a Yiddish-speaking day school.
True.
Okay, we'll hold it here for today, and then we'll go into Parshas Bo.